So good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here for this session of the African Tea Time, and very privileged and happy to have our speakers today that are going to help us discuss a very intriguing and very important topic that is Africa-China relations in post-COVID-19 era. I know it's a very important discussion that I always say. There's some discussions, all discussions that we have at tea time are very useful, and but particularly when we're talking about the international relations, we know how collaborating and partnering with global entities can be challenging, and China especially. Its position in the world is an important, especially not just necessarily in the world, but its positioning with its interaction in Africa. It's an important discussion that we've had from before with the help of Arhin, and we'll continue to have. And today we were very privileged and happy to have a second presenter, that is Dr. Adovo Tsikudo, that is going to discuss the topic with Arhin, because every end of March, every year, I should say, we invite the Afro Center for Africa, Afro-Sino Center. I get this wrong every time, but it's Afro-Sino Center for International Relations. We always have Arhin especially represent the center in discussing what's current, the type of research they're doing, the types of projects and discussions that are going there as it relates to Africa and China collaboration or partnership or relations. So today we're continuing kind of that discussion, but then looking at the things from the post-COVID era. And we have two presenters that are going to lead out in this discussion. The first one is Arhin Acheampong. Arhin is an alum of Michigan State University. I don't fail to say this all the time. And currently is the Deputy Director at the Afro-Sino Center for International Relations that is based in Ghana. And our second speaker is Dr. Kwame Tsikudo. Dr. Tsikudo is an assistant professor of African Studies and Geography at Thomas Jefferson University in Pennsylvania. And Dr. Tsikudo is also a research fellow at the Afro-Sino Center for International Relations. I really wouldn't want to talk much. I know I always forget to introduce myself. I'm Damaris Choti. I coordinate the African Tea Time on behalf of the African Studies Center here at Michigan State University. And it's always a privilege to meet new people, to engage in discussions that otherwise I would have not even had an opportunity to be a part of. I've learned a lot by interacting and being in spaces like this with very important discussions like this. So I'm really, really happy to welcome you both to facilitate our discussion today. I'll take the back seat and leave this for you both. Arhin, I believe you're on to start, and then we'll continue. So how it goes, we'll have the presentation from our two speakers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Choti. It's always good to join the African Tea Time this part of the year, or this time of the year, to talk about Africa-China engagements. Doc already mentioned, today our topic is going to be Africa-China relations in a post-COVID-19 era. And I'll be doing this with Dr. Kwame Adovo Tsikudo, who led this research work. This is actually a report that the center did on building a strong post-pandemic Ghanaian economy through trade and investment with China. We'll be talking about, why this topic, why this is important, why trade and investment with China, and why China. So firstly, in this presentation, what you are going to see is that I'll be giving some background and context as to why this report, the essence of it. Dr. Tsikudo will take from the methods, he will take us through what they did as a team to put this report together. So he'll talk about the methods, and then specifically he's going to talk about structural transformation, which was more or less the crust of the work that we did. And then he'll talk about Africa and China during COVID, FOCAC action plan. So the FOCAC is the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation. And every 3 years, they meet and put together an action plan, which both parties would work on for the next 3 years. And then mainly, like we said in our report, it was about trade and investment. So you look at the trade aspects, the investment aspects. Then I'll come back and I'll take over from closing the knowledge gap in Africa-China relations. And then I would talk about the recommendations that were proffered in the report that we did. So why China? Why this report? The 1955 Bandung Conference actually sort of set the pace for Africa-China engagement. Around that time, and this is again 1955, African countries were fighting for independence, and China also had a strong anti-colonial stance and was working to help all other countries, especially in the global south, to get their independence. So the relationship started forging between Africa and China, I mean, in contemporary times, to help African countries gain independence, or to go do away with the anti-colonial system that existed around that time. I mean, the colonial system that existed around that time. And so Africa-China relations, based on that, have come to comprise of both material and non-material exchanges. Material in terms of provision of infrastructure, aid, and all of that, and as well as non-material, such as diplomatic support at multilateral levels, trainings, and people-to-people engagement. Also, we see that these encounters were formalized in 2000 through the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, and this was one of a kind. FOCAC was a one of a kind cooperation or forum that brought together Africa, China in a way that was supposed to sort of set a pace for Africa-China relations in a formal way, and also in a collaborative way. So we know that Africa has been dealing with its partners individually. So we have at the country level. So this one was supposed to bring Africa together as a bloc with China as a partner to forge its friendship and have formal arrangements or agreement as to how the whole continent wants to deal with China. Now, we also know that the COVID-19 pandemic became very crucial in the world. I mean, some 3-4 years ago, we just couldn't imagine this world today because, of course, there was a pandemic and we didn't know how this was going to go. And partners, international partners, were all trying to sort of build their first of all, protect their people, build their economies, and also build their external relations in a way to survive the post-pandemic era. And so we will see how Dr. Adovo is going to be talking about how China responded, whilst dealing with its internal issues, how it responded to external partners, especially Africa, and how the rest of the world responded to Africa, and how that has shaped Africa-China engagement, and why that is important in what happens to Africa-China or Africa's international relations moving forward. Now, one of the key things that led us to look at or to come up with this report is that the World Bank estimates that Africa needs 6% growth from 2023 onwards to return to pre-pandemic status. Now, this implies that Africa must double, or actually more than double, its current growth rate of 2.4% to meet its minimal target. And what we are supposing, or what we are saying, is that for Africa to do this, it would need all of its strategic partners, especially China, because now China is the leading trade or investment partner on the continent. Africa's trade and investment partner. And also, when it comes to foreign direct investment, China is leading in terms of the quantum of money that comes. So, Doc, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arhin, and thank you very much, Dr. Shoti, for the invitation. And yeah, so I'll take it over from here, talking about methods and other aspects of the report. Now, I will have to say that for methods, this project was underpinned by qualitative and quantitative methods that were put together. We did surveys for adult Ghanaians, adult resident Ghanaians across the country. Mainly, we were focused on, we divided the country into zones. So there were two zones actually. There was a southern zone and also the northern zone. And in each of these zones, we decided to sample individuals' responses from that to just have a feel of how people sort of perceive China as a post-pandemic development partner. And this is important because building an economy or building a collaborative engagement requires trust. And as most of you who have, been paying attention to this China-African engagement, you will know that the conversation will be replete with a lot of distrust and misinformation and all of that. And in the era of misinformation, this can be a very important thing. So we did a survey. So that's one of the things that we actually, we also had interviews with a range of people, scholars, academics, NGOs, government parastatals like Ghana Investment Promotion Center, and then some workers' union, that's Ghana United Traders Union, and also the Ghana Trade Union Congress, which were very important stakeholders when it comes to external engagement that our country, especially Ghana, sort of forged with other partners. The caveat here I want to, so before we go any further, I want to underscore is that you will hear us and me in particular talk about Ghana because we want to use Ghana as a case study to highlight the ways in which African countries sort of engage with China. The situation might not be the same in other African countries, but we hope that this sort of provide a framework for other studies to be conducted. We also had conversation with the embassy, Chinese embassy officials in Accra, and this took the format of a question and answer. So we sent them questions and they responded with their responses. Unfortunately, we tried to get Ghanaian government officials to give us audience in response to some of the questions that we have, but then that did not materialize. The Ministry of Finance was a key element that unit that we identified. But the interesting thing is that during this survey, which was September 2022, they were also intensely engaged with negotiation with the IMF, as most African countries were at that time, in terms of having their debt suspended or having new tranche of money or negotiation, a new tranche of loans or other agreement that would bring some resources to shore up the country. So we missed out on talking to the Ministry of Finance and regional integration. We also, and economic planning, sorry. And then we also didn't get a chance to talk to the Ministry of Trade and Industry, which was one of the key ministries that we had approached to give us audience. We also sought to have audience with the Africa Free Trade Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, which is housed in Accra, to talk to us, but that did not actually materialize. So what we'll be hearing us talk about, or the inferences will be drawn, will be based on academics and literature reviews and other things. We also did systematic literature review, which involved us doing keyword searches in Google and academic premier search engines, just to find a way to understand how this idea of China and COVID and Africa was being had in the literature. Next slide, please. So I have to begin from laying some of the theoretical framework to start with. Because I think that is important for us to get from here. I won't get into the depth of the conversation, especially when it comes to structural transformation. But I just want to give a flavor for us to understand or foreground the necessity of trade and investment in post pandemic reconstruction of African economies. So if you look carefully at this figure on your screen right now, this is a figure that we pulled from our World in Data record, which is also consistent with what the World Bank has and also the IMF has. And it shows the trajectory of development, especially per capita over the centuries. And if you look closely down there to your left, the lowest bottom to your left, you will see that Africa is on there, and compared Africa, that's the middle section. Compared Africa to the rest of the regions, Africa's curve is flat, generally flat. So that means that in terms of development or per capita growth and development, it was lagging behind the rest of the rest of the world, so to speak. So Latin America, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, it was not competitive at all. So there were questions as to what can be, why that is the case, and we'll get into some of that later on. So this is an intriguing sort of figure, sort of give us a snapshot to have understanding of the structural underpinnings of the African economies, especially as they are, challenged or being confronted with in the area of a post-pandemic constraint. So this is why we decided to think about structural transformation, right? And so we want to think about structural transformation as the process where we shift resources, be it labor in particular, and also capital from, certain sectors to another sectors where they are more productive or they are more efficient. So, for example, in Africa, over 70% of the African economies are what we call informal economy. So majority of the African continent, and this also plays into the narrative when COVID was happening, where most of the African countries could not actually lock down because the safety net were not there, and people had to people's daily bread were being shortchanged, and there was no government intervention to actually support people if it was a serious lockdown, right? So structural transformation was important for us to think about, because then it also helped us to think about what is happening in terms of in the area of informal economies, what is happening in the area of agriculture, which majority of African countries are reliant on. And in the narrative or the discourse on China-African relations, later we'll hear us talk about the fact that majority of what we export from the continent to Africa to China is raw materials, which has to change, right? So to think about structural transformation, we are looking at both sectoral changes. So within a sector, so let's take agriculture, for example. How can we make agriculture more efficient? How can we make it more productive using trade and investment, right? And most of these sort of initiatives were encapsulated or captured in the 2021 FOCAC agreement. I also want to think about that in relation to that. The other aspect of structural transformation that we also want to think about is how the various sectors. So we take agriculture, we take industry, we think about construction. How can they be improved? How can they be made better? And then as a whole, we come to what we call articulated economy. So where one process leads to the other, so that there's no sort of breakage in that process. And it is important to also underscore this idea of structural transformation, because after World War II, we saw a lot of that happen, starting with Japan, and then the rest of the Asian tigers, which became what we call the developmental states. So the developmental states are basically states that sort of prioritize development as their objectives, right? And this was happening in Taiwan, Malaysia, Singapore. So this was important moment for us to think about. So one of my favorite quotes from those of us who are familiar with the developmental state theory or the literature is from Peter Evans, who wrote that if the developmental state was important back then or in the past, it is much more critical and more important now than ever before, right? And we want to think that if the developmental state was important in the 1950s, 1960s, 1940s, 1970s, it is much more critical in the post-pandemic world, especially in the context of Africa, as when we try to realign and rethink about what we could do in this era. So that is the general sort of a theoretical framework on which we are building this idea of a post-pandemic engagement with China. So in which way can the trade and investment that the Chinese and African countries are engaged in will help us transform Africa, right? But before we get into the integrity, there are other things that we also need to think about, like what happened within the continent when it came to COVID and COVID-19 and Africa, right? So we want to underscore the fact also that Africa is structurally challenged in a lot of ways, and we can, I mean, we have had conversation with all sorts of scholars all over. People have varied sort of views, but one thing that we can run away from is that the African continent is challenged in a lot of ways. And when it comes to health sectors, the health sector is burdened and stressed. Malaria is one of those diseases that have stressed the African health system. Recently, there was a news that Cape Verde is malaria-free, which I applaud, and I hope that the rest of the African continent or the rest of other African countries are taking a cue to make the continent, rid the continent of malaria. If Cape Verde could do it, I'm sure it is possible elsewhere. TB was the other thing. HIV/AIDS, diabetes are other diseases that have made it almost impossible or have made it even hard for this the health system that is already burdened to be able to provide the adequate sort of healthcare. So in the context of COVID, I remember sitting in my apartment in Illinois at the time and monitoring the news. You know, school went on lockdown. We were preparing to go to the American Association of Geographers meeting in I think San Francisco. We were planning parties and all of that, and sadly none of that could happen. And as the news broke as the news spread through North America, especially in the United States and also Europe, and we saw the devastations on TV, we were all wondering. I was wondering as well. I was calling cousins, parents, aunties, nephews. Are you okay? You know, what can we do to help? You know, some of us have to send money home. I'm sure most of you did that as well, just to help people, you know, stay at home and not, you know, become a victim of the disease as it unfolds. Because none of us knew if the health system that were better, especially in Europe and North America, were crumbling and could not even accommodate what was happening. Then I was wondering, or we were all wondering what was going to happen within Africa. So this sort of generated all sorts of questions, and also in the context of trade and investment, we asked the question: in what ways can Chinese Africa investment and trade make the health system better on the African continent, right? And so it was not far-fetched that a lot of doomsday sort of prophecies were all over the news. Melinda Gates was one of those who famously said on national TV, in fact, international TV, CNN that she was suspecting that a lot of African streets or the streets on the African continent were going to be littered with bodies because there isn't enough capacity to be able to, you know, take care of the people, right? Most of us were outraged about that, though. But the interesting thing is that as we speak, so this data is from the African CDC website, and so as of January this year, what they are reporting is that over 12 million people had, or there were 12 million cases, over 12 million cases of COVID. But the death was, unfortunately, we had over 256,000 people die from the disease. But the recovery rate has been remarkable, right? So so this like got a lot of people like thinking, like, why is it that we're able to have, quote unquote, an African miracle when it came to COVID-19? This was a continent that was being, belittled in terms of its capacity to handle this. Compared to other places, people were, the numbers were very high. So how is the African continent, African countries able to do this, right? So in the grand scheme of things, a lot of factors came into play. Rural livelihood was one of those. About 40% of the most African countries, if not more, are rural. Majority of the people live in the rural areas, right? So that sort of minimized exposure to, rural life, where majority of much of the disease was raging. The other thing was the previous exposure to diseases. We've had Ebola, several bouts of Ebola, unfortunately in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea. We've had other diseases. HIV/AIDS is one of those. And people think that, or the scientific community thinks that this exposure sort of provided the basis for people to become immune. And so with COVID-19 coming, that, provided the resilience to withstand some of this. The other thing is also youthful population. And it's true that Africa is number one when it comes to youth. Other continents, Asia, for example, is railing. Go to Japan, for example, they are, having issues with their population. But in Africa, between majority of the population is in the youthful bracket, which is something that people want to think about, especially in relation to disease spread and also the contraction. That because of the youthfulness of the population, we're able to quickly shake off any sort of infection anytime it happened. So the interesting thing here is that the things that were being talked about as being underdevelopment attribute of the continent actually have become its savior in the era of pandemic, right? And I think that this looks to be another conversation for official research. I think that we should say more about this. There's a miracle when it comes to COVID-19 in Africa. It's remarkable. I have a student who was fascinated about this and sort of trying to understand some of the socio-cultural dynamics or the political economy that sort of underpins the creativity or the innovations that came to the fore to make sure that the rate of COVID was minimized in that regard. So when it comes to COVID, the question has always been that how are African countries and China sort of collaborating? Our research shows that the relationship has rather strengthened or has been strengthened and consolidated in a lot of ways, right? And as Arhin mentioned, the engagement between China and Africa takes two forms: material and non-material exchanges. And we saw a lot of this happen during the COVID pandemic. For example, China took part in the suspension of debt to African countries. So a lot of countries got the relief. Ghana was one of those. Zambia and other African countries also benefited from that. So there was that, which also formed part of the goodwill that the Chinese are cultivating across Africa. There was also donations of vaccines and medical equipment. And when it comes to Ghana, we saw a lot of that happen. The first flight of medical equipment and kit from China to Africa actually was destined for Ghana. Actually benefited one of the largest hospitals in West Africa, the Kolebu Teaching Hospital, which is in Accra, the Ghana University of Ghana Medical Center, and a lot of other health centers benefited from this. There were also collaborations between African experts on health and also Chinese experts in terms of training and thinking about ideas exchanges. So that also happened. And one of the things that also happened was that African countries quickly issued statement of support, because as you know, the critique, especially in the West, was that, China covered up, they were the source of all of this. So there was enough, misinformation already. And Africa, a lot of African countries, issued statement of support. And guess what? The Chinese responded. The Chinese president, Xi Jinping, called 11 African countries, and just to tell them about how they are feeling and the kind of support they could also give. And one of our respondents actually said that China does not forget. And indeed, China does not forget. So if you look at the current rate of, or the depth of the intensity of engagement now, between African countries or individual African countries and China, we can also trace that to what happened during the Mao Zedong era, for example, or during the 1980s, 1990s, for example. That sort of provide the foundation for what is happening. So that this material and non-material engagement continued and consolidated during the period. Next slide. So it was also during COVID-19 that the FOCAC agreement or the FOCAC, the 8th FOCAC was held, organized in Dakar. And this was in December. After a long delay, it eventually took off or happened, right? And 9 agreements were actually adopted during that meeting. Healthcare was one of them. Agricultural development was one of them. Green economy, capacity building, poverty, cultural and people-to-people exchanges, trade and investment promotion were other, as well as digital innovation, peace and security. And these are very important elements, and consistently they have over the years remained or been a key part of how China and Africa sort of engage each other. But the interesting thing about the 2021 FOCAC agreement was that it generated a lot of debate. People were wondering whether China was withdrawing from the continent based on this, the fact that there was a huge cut actually compared to what happened in 2018. There was a huge cut, and then certain aspects of the report also did not include conversation on infrastructure. And if you have been watching the discourse on China-African relations, you will know that infrastructure is a key part of that conversation. And for that not to feature prominently in the 2021 was something that people actually got interested in. And the conversation was raging both here in North America and the African continent and all over. But these 9 programs were important. But we, in particular, want to focus on trade. We want to think about trade. We want to think about investment and the way in which they will connect to post-pandemic engagement. So agriculture, green economy, digital economy, manufacturing, infrastructure, and people-to-people agreement were the key subset when it comes to investment, the investment proposal that came forth during the 2021 action plan. And these are important in thinking about structural transformation that I talked about earlier. In which way can we make agriculture better? How can green economy? So green economy basically is thinking about, you know, all sort of engagement that are less carbon intensive. So how do we shift from a carbon intensive economy? And majority of African countries are carbon intensive economies. So how do we shift from that? And what are the parameters within which we can work, right? Digital economy. Ghana is, you know, has a mantra digitalization that the government is promoting vehemently. Manufacturing, very important. For majority of African countries, manufacturing forms less than 20% of their annual GDP, which is something that we need to work towards improving, because it goes against the nature of the engagement between China and Africa. Because what we tend to do now is export a lot of raw materials and import manufacturers. So what that means is that the manufacturers that are being imported from Africa, from China and elsewhere, maybe are, you know, deindustrializing the continent. And so we should find a way to rethink that. And what will say an industrial policy sort of play in that conversation? Infrastructure, as I mentioned, is a key part of the conversation, but then it was indirectly not included within the main communique that was issued after the FOCAC agreement in 2021. We suspect, however, that this was being rolled, and indirectly, this is what it is being rolled into the Belt and Road Initiative, which most African countries have signed on to, right? So in Ghana, for example, we have a lot of those initiatives going back as far as 2028, where Sino Hydro has done an agreement with the Ghanaian government to industrialize using bauxite, right? And the Ghanaian government used that, touted that prominently, especially going up to the 2020 election, because they said they've got this money from Sino Hydro, and they're going to turn around the country infrastructure-wise, industrialization-wise. Well, I will say that much of that is not material, it has yet to materialize. But then you get a sense about how some of these things have been talked about. People to people agreement are very important because it help people to expose people to what China does, and then also help people to think about China in different ways. And if in a way it goes to think about link up with this idea of soft power, right? So over the years, we've had a lot of African personnel, students, security personnel go to China for training, both long-term and short-term. All of this are part of the arrangement that is being put forward that was going to be boosted, right? And so when it comes to investment, some of the people we talk to have varied, sort of responses. The responses ranges from those that were benign, those that were very critical, and we couldn't include all of them. But I encourage you to take a look, take a read of the report. It's on the Afro-Sino Center website, and then read it for yourself. So one of the things that came up was that Chinese investments are good because they help in, getting to places that are not already considered viable. So greenfield sort of investment is what people were looking out for, right? And it's important to think about that. So how can we have a mass of local entrepreneurs who will help with that greenfield sort of investment? Some of our surveys also talk about the malls that are, dotted across the African continent. South Africa has a lot of Chinese malls. Ghana is beginning to catch up on the fever of Chinese malls that are being built. How does that sort of feed into the narrative of trade and investment, especially within the local economies that are receiving this, right? And in Ghana, some people have, the consumers on one hand are saying like, okay, this is good because then it allows us to get cheaper goods. But on the other hand, what does that do to industries, manufacturing factories that are operating on African within that space? So there are a lot of contention about it. Ultimately, there was a question or concern that was raised in relation to what government could do. So some of our correspondents were saying, which were primarily Ghana United Traders Union, Trade Association, and also the Trade Union Congress were calling on government and this interface by the Ghana Investment Promotion Center to actually look at ways in which it can actually enforce, the regulations to make sure that Chinese actually do what they actually were authorized to do. Because what came up during our conversations with some of these people was that most of the time Chinese investors are issued licenses, but then to do A, but then they end up doing B. And this is because there is no follow-up since after the license has been issued by authorities that were in charge, right? So people were calling on government to continue to enforce that. And when it comes to trade, most of us, especially Ghana and most African countries, trade between China is very dense, and it remains one of the key elements or the key unit conduit of engagement between China and Africa. As I speak with you, as we talk now, China is the leading trading partner for Ghana, right? And most African countries, that is true. For a single country to do that is enormous, and it even outcompetes the European Union, right? So the FOCAC agreement sort of sought to promote more trade, and organize more trade promotion as in Africa and in China. Part of this was also agriculture. The interesting thing about trade and the FOCAC agreement, and also what we think is important to address going forward, is that there's a running deficit. There has been a running deficit of trade between China and Africa since the 2000s. And this is because there's a lot more export of raw materials from Africa than manufacturers, right? So that deficit needs to be addressed. Unfortunately, this does not help us. The 2021 agreement does not sort of explicitly help us to address that deficit. But we believe that the promotion of trade is that is a way to, the Chinese are selling this idea that if we focus more on it, then we might be able to offset the deficit. But it takes much more than that. So we have to go back to thinking about that structural adjustment. How can we take some of this investment and move them into areas where they can be more efficient rather than just paying lip service to the whole thing? What can we do in terms of developing a viable, effective industrial policies that will take some of this investment and then make sure that they are connected to what is ongoing within these African countries and linking them to their own national plans? If that is not, and our research is showing that there's a gap in that area. So there's that idea of industrial policy and how this connect to the Chinese investment and trade is a miss, and then therefore more needs to be done. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll hand it over to Arhin to continue laying out the closing of the knowledge gap, which is also part of, like I mentioned before, building a strong post or robust post-pandemic economy is based on trust. And so the knowledge gap conversation will shed light on that going forward. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Tsikudo, for that very elaborate flow of what you did with the team on this report. Now, the reason why we want to talk about the knowledge gap in Afro-Sino relations, as Dr. Kwame Tsikudo has already said, is also because we as a center are trying to bridge that gap, mainly because people-to-people engagement, as Kwame mentioned earlier, is very important. It's very important, and that is one of the things that has helped China in terms of sort of surpassing the US and Europe in Africa and on the continent, because Chinese contractors, Chinese workers, when they come, to some extent, try to mingle, try to, make contact with Africans. But again, there's a huge information and knowledge gap, which we believe that if we're able to help address, it would help forge the Africa-China engagements that we all anticipate to help with a win-win collaboration. For example, during COVID-19, we saw what happened between some Africans living in China or who had gone to China to trade, and the response that came from African governments and from Chinese governments on that issue. And so if we're doing Africa-China engagement at that high level without paying attention to the people-to-people engagement, it may come crumbling. So fundamentally, what we found was that majority of the survey participants knew very little about China. Now, when they say basic, most of them by basic, they've heard about China, they know the Chinese are in town, and that's just about it. And for poor, nothing at all. So even if you just accumulated the basic plus the poor, that is a huge number. And also those who are above average were those who at least knew something about what the Chinese had done in their country. So there's a huge gap between what people know about Africa-China and what is actually happening with Africa-China engagements on the continent. Now, we found out that over 55% of the respondents knew nothing, even about China's COVID-19 support for Ghana, right? And this is interesting because China was the first country to donate to Ghana. They were the first to bring in the PPEs that people needed during the pandemic. And yet, more than half of the survey respondents knew nothing about that. Also, that the respondents got information about Africa-China mainly through traditional and social media. And in the era of misinformation and miseducation, it is scary to have that most of the masses would get information about Africa-China from social media, especially if you look at with relations to the geopolitics that is happening, a lot needs to be done to get Africa-China information out there that is research, that is objective, and that actually speaks to the facts. Now, we also asked the question about what the respondents thought about juxtaposing Chinese relations with Africa to Africa's relation to the rest of the world. Now, you find that majority of them thought that engagement with others, that is the rest of the world, or like especially Europe and America, was superior to China. But about 55 of them thought that China's was superior. Now, this data is important because China's numbers are actually growing. If you compare to previous data that was done, this is a huge leap for Ghana. For China, with regards to the perception of Africans, or at least in this case of Ghanaians of China. And at least only 38 thought that the engagement with China was bad, which when you compare to those who thought was superior is way better than what we have seen in previous data. Now, at the end of the report, of course, we came up with some recommendations that we believe, if both partners can look at, would help to forge a good or a formidable post-pandemic era when it comes to trade and investment. Now, you would also see that in our recommendations, the focus is on what Africa can do and not necessarily what China should be doing, but what Africa could be doing to shape its engagements with China. So I'll just go ahead and read what I have on the slide. So the first recommendation was that Africa has a running infrastructure deficit exceeding 150 billion. Dr. Adovo talked about this. And what we are saying here is that we cannot move away from infrastructure, because trade and investment rely heavily on infrastructure. And they move away from infrastructure. Some of us will speculate that it's as a result of all these geopolitics that is going on, where China was accused of death trap in Africa, because we know that infrastructure investments are quite expensive, or very, very expensive. In fact, extremely expensive. And so investing in infrastructure would, of course, blow up the numbers in terms of debt. But again, the infrastructure deficit is huge. And so partners have to pay attention, or should be paying attention to Africa's infrastructure deficit. Otherwise, most of the things that we talk about will not suffice, because again, you need the roads, you need the railways to move goods and services. Infrastructure provision, actually, I wouldn't read everything because it's all in the report, and I'll be sharing the link to the report, but I'll just go ahead and summarize what we have. So we are saying here that both sides should reconsider infrastructure investment and work collaboratively to reinstate the initiative in future action plans. Africa really needs to bridge its infrastructure gap. Now, secondly, we talk about what African countries should do in terms of supporting indigenous capital formation and accumulation, right? African businesses, African investors should be able to accumulate and be able to form or to build capital, right? What do you see, especially in some other work that we have done, is that when Chinese investors come to the continent, they come and they partner with African investment who do not necessarily also have the financial muscle to support the investment that they are doing. And so what happens is that it turns into an imbalance, right, arrangement, where, of course, the one coming in with more of the money tends to benefit more and tends to sort of have a bigger share of the investment or whatever trade or business that is being done. So we are saying that African countries should encourage and support vigorous indigenous capital formation and accumulation. Now, We also say that a critical mass of indigenous entrepreneurs should appropriate skills transfer and partnership formation with Chinese businesses and ensure long-term prosperity and the fight against capital flight from the continent. So African entrepreneurs should also start to consider China as viable partners. And once they do this, they should insist on skill transfer so that once the partnerships are done, or even as the partnerships are ongoing, the Ghanaians or the African partners are also able to expand their businesses based on or as a result of the skills that they have accumulated or they've gotten from their engagements with their Chinese counterparts. The third one is that we advocate for strengthened investment laws and to clarify what counts as investment. Dr. Adovo Tsikudo talked about this, because you need a peaceful and tranquil environment to forge partnerships. So if African or Ghanaian investors are at loggerheads with their Chinese counterparts, this partnership, trade and investment partnership would most likely collapse. The fourth recommendation was investment plans, was that investment plans should be assessed from their potential contribution and connection with the with other sectors, right? And here we are talking about a structural transformation. So if an investment is coming into the country, how do we assess to look at how that investment within that particular sector is going to impact the other sectors? And that may help governments come up with policies that will sort of connect or link or will draw the linkages, you know, intersectorial linkages, so that the whole continent or the whole ecosystem benefits from a single investment. The fifth one is that African governments should prioritize removing the bottlenecks that investors encounter in the operations. Now, what you will find in most African countries is that there are a lot of bottlenecks, right? And so when investors come in, they are not even able to go through the processes. And so there's a lot of investment or capital flight, again, from foreign investors who are coming in. So they come into the country, they are not too sure of how the systems run, and then they move out of the country. And Africa is losing a lot of investment as a result of this. So that we should really try not to have a broad brush approach, you know, where we just, okay, say that this is the policy for investment, but to go into the nitty-gritties and make it clear so that when investors come, irrespective of their sectors, would know exactly what to do because the blueprint is there to follow. Then our sixth recommendation, again, targeted at African governments, was that they could seek joint ventures in technology-related investment to link up with other sectors of the African economies, especially agriculture. Now, again, we're talking about this structural transformation, right? Where we can set this sectoral transformation where you can connect sectors, right? So how do we now move our agriculture from the traditional ways of doing agriculture to using technology to support, and not just using technology for other stuff that are typical of tech. Then this is a very, very important recommendation that we come up with. Again, looking at it in terms of the African continental free trade area and connecting Africa and not just the individual African countries. How do investors trade with other African countries once they are set up in one African country? One of the basic things that we find is the issue of convertibility, right? Of currency convertibility, where you come to Ghana, you have to go to Togo, then you have to change your currency from CD to CFA, and then you move from Benin to Nigeria, and then now you need a Naira, and then, you know, you go to East Africa, you need a shillings and different shillings and all of that. So one of the things that the African Union has actually started exploring is the Pan-African payment and settlement system. And the Chinese already have the China's cross-border interbank payment system that is called the CIPS, or some people call it the CHIPS. So how do we start looking at connecting these systems and sort of reinforcing these systems to be able to do what they are supposed or they are meant to do? I think the PAPS is doing very well in West Africa, but it's yet to, take off in the other RECs. So we're hoping that African countries will pay key attention to this. And one of the key players in this area will be the African Development Bank. They can play a key role working with the central banks of all these other African countries to make sure that this works. Now, we also talked about African governments' increase of import of Chinese capital goods, right? So we really need to start increasing our import of Chinese technology, machinery, and equipment rather than just finished goods, right? So African governments must start looking at that because we could use commodity revenues to diversify current economies to reduce over-reliance on commodity exports. So fundamentally, let's try to, of course, importing Chinese goods is necessary. We need that. There's actually in our report, we talk about how a shift, an abrupt shift in that would sort of crumble a lot of African economies. But what we are saying is that we should start considering exporting technology and heavy equipment and machinery, which should come with spare parts and trained technicians to help boost the manufacturing capacity on the continent. So again, this also goes back to some of the recommendations we've already made about African investors' ability or financial muscle to be able to bring in these imports. And the African Exim Bank can support African investors in this vein. Now, the ninth one is that African governments need to ensure industrial upgrades by incentivizing existing entrepreneurs. Government support of market research and identifying niche investment areas is crucial for long-term advancement. So this is building on the point already made that government and continental institutions can support. But this support or these supports should not be random or should not just be given because we think, but that a lot of research, market research has to go into these things to make sure that where we are putting our investment will yield the right returns for us, right? We can just put investment anywhere. And we think that one of the things that is lacking is this market research. We need a lot of research. We need a lot of in-depth analysis to make sure that the limited resources that we are spending are actually going to yield the right results. Then our final recommendation is that both sides need to cooperate in building trust among citizens and build trust for vibrant post-pandemic engagement. And this is where centers like the Afro-Sino come in, and this is where we need a lot more research that will come up with the objective things that are happening on the ground, just so that we can sort of do away with most of the speculations and skepticism around Africa-China engagements to ensure that at that top level, the elite political level, there's trust, and also at the level of the masses, there is that trust to engage and to do the trade, and also to be comfortable enough to invest with both partners. So thank you so much. That will be it for our presentation, and we definitely look forward to an engaging discussion. Thank you so much. Dr. Choti, I hand over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna leave most of the work for you, Arhin and Dr. Tsikudo, because I don't know what's happening with my internet. In fact, I have somebody here who is helping with that. So we can take it on to the discussion part, and please just help me out here today. I need the conversation to keep going, especially to have our audience engage the speakers. But if you see me just kind of off, an IT person had to come down and help with this somehow. So, but for right now, if you have a question or comment for the speakers, please go ahead and mute yourself, type your question on the chat. They're here to lead the discussion. Thank you so very much for very insightful. A question that I had before I kind of go off. So do you think comparatively China is a better partner for Africa in general?
Dr. Tsikudo, you want to take that?
Yeah, so yeah, thank you. I always don't I am always uneasy to do the comparative analysis. The reason is that China has its own advantage in terms of the kind of things it brings to the table, and other partners also have their own sort of things that they bring to the table. And so it would be unfair to say, yeah, China is good and China is bad, or the West is good and the West is bad. What is important, however, is how are these African countries dealing with China and the rest of the world? If we can, as Africans or African countries, and here I'm speaking as an African, if we can determine our needs and use, whatever resources or whatever is being brought to the table to benefit our needs or fulfill these needs, I think that should be the game changer. That should be what the priority should be. After all, in international relations, there's nothing like a friend or a foe. All that is at stake is interest. So the question is, what is Africans' interest? What are the individual African countries? What are their interests when they engage with China? Let's identify that and let's align that with what the Chinese are bringing to the table. And this is where the idea of building capacity becomes important. Let's build the capacity to engage Africans constructively. Let's build the capacity to engage the Chinese productively. If we don't have the capacity, we'll always be shortchanged in this sort of negotiations or conversation we had with the Chinese. So there's much to be done. So the binary, I try to veer away from the binary categorization. The Chinese bring good stuff to the table. They also bring bad stuff to the table. The West bring bad stuff to the table. They also bring some good stuff to the table. So let's identify our needs and try to align them and then move on from there. Thank you.
Okay.
So Maj, it does seem like it's all about aligning our interest with the partnership.
I believe that is a big chunk of what we need to do. We should veer away. I always say that it is not productive to say China is bad or China is good. It is more productive for us to be in charge of the conversation. So the Chinese say they're going to do this. Okay, we're going to do that. We want to make sure that whatever you're going to do, it creates linkages within our economy. It boosts our economy, not to shortchange this or undermine it in any way. So by doing so, if we can be able to align the Chinese interest to our interests, I think it will be a better sort of engagement than we have had, because so far, majority of the conversation or majority of the engagement have been lopsided. We want to make sure that is changed.
Okay, Francis, please go for it, sir.
Thank you so much, Doc and Arhin, for sharing the research, the conversation. My name is Gishuki. I'm calling you from Kenya. A great Pan-Africanist. I love Africa. I hang around Africa. I'm still here to come to Ghana. I have a friend in Ghana, so I need to come to visit Ghana.
You have an open invitation.
Thank you so much, Kwame. It'll be great to have the conversation. I'm very passionate about young people. I spent all my years seeing what's the role of young people, and you did mention about Africa has the highest, young people population in the world today, and probably in your conversation with the young people, what is their voice? What are they saying? If this question, because tomorrow and even today, they have a bigger conversation of their perception about the future of relations, international relations. So I'll be keen to hear what young people's voice is, especially below 35. And because when the first conference was done in 1955 in Bandung in Indonesia, West Java, where I also spent a bit of time, you know, in conversation with young people also in terms of their growth, it gives me an impression of, you know, how over the last of almost, you know, 50 years down the line, and we have been able to track that history. So share with me a bit of that, and then the second question I would be looking at is, and I think Dr. Choti has mentioned it, is when the conversations are there at the FOCAC, how much do we get our say? And I think that's now where the question of conversation, diplomacy, research work, and I think the power of conviction. And thirdly, then I'm seeing what is the role of the African Union in this? Where are they positioning themselves? Because they are the voice of us in Africa, where we cannot be able to bargain as a country specific. So I'm looking at that that composition, and I think Dr. Kwame, you might agree with me. In the 90s, there were so many conversation around the structural adjustment programs that were also coming up with the World Bank, and remember the conversation about democracy versus development. So there were these issues there, and I think it's and of course China now in its approach. What is so different? Thank you.
All right, thank you. So I will.
Yes, go for it.
If you permit me, now I will try to respond to the first and then the third question. And now he has been doing a lot with the African Union, and so I know he has a lot of insight to share on that. And then maybe we can extend that conversation to the after. So to say, I mean, we have to be happy that at least today you and I can be proud that we have. Africa has elected a president who is less than 50 years in Senegal, so that is a good start. Mohammed had asked a question several years ago about, you know, questioning the ages of the president on Africa. It was a conference where he was like, what's the president of how old is the president of Zimbabwe? Then we have our own Uncle Bob in power. The president of South Africa, Zuma, was then around. And most of these guys were already in the 70s, 80s, some of them were 90s, you know. So this idea of the youth has always been around, right? Unfortunately, I would say that the voices of the youth these days, especially when it comes to China, Africa, I wouldn't say have been marginalized, but hardly makes it to the table. In our report, what we are saying, and other report, especially the Afro Barometer, which came out, I think this was 2021 report, June report, highlighted some of this as well. When the youth were surveyed, they liked the idea that the Chinese were able to bring in goods that they are accessible. So they like the Chinese on that. On the other hand, they would prefer that African countries are more democratic than the Chinese are, right? So that is the extent to which the youth's voices made it to the table. But other than that, we haven't heard much. Now, what is also very pertinent to point out is that the Chinese have been doing a lot in this regard to connect with. So this is coming through the channel of people-to-people engagement. So a lot of people are being recruited into the Confucius Institute who are college students. A lot of people are going to other Confucius classrooms, learning about China, right? And this is a way to cultivate, build a class of people who will be, so to speak, receptive to the Chinese idea in the future. And within that literature, it's always said that if you had an education in country A, and that country A comes to country B, where you are originally from, I ask for something, you are likely to be more receptive than a country C that you know very little about, right? So the youth, the voices of the youth has not made it to that high level yet. Most of the conversation has been state-to-state diplomacy, But we are beginning to see changes. We are beginning to see changes with the expansion of the Confucius Institute ideas, and then the people-to-people discourses, which is now made it part into the FOCAC agreement since 2018. And so we hope that that continues. But then, in addition to that, we want to see more in terms of, more youthful representation, let's say in parliament, across, youthful representations at the ministries, across, but that comes with capacity. So if we need to, the youth have to, we have, that responsibility has to be there. We need that education to be able to be a minister or play a role in your local government. For example, you need a certain level, a degree of education to be able to do that. So the onus is on us a little bit too. Let's position ourselves to be able to do that. The third issue has to do with democracy. Yeah, so like I highlighted before, the structural adjustment issue had happened in Africa. Almost Africa has, was subjected. Almost the whole of Africa was subjected to the structural adjustment issue. The structural adjustment. The interesting thing about structural adjustment and China is that it was structural adjustment on one hand that actually opened the floodgate for the Chinese to come in, right? Because now people begin. I remember Uncle Bob, that's Robert Mugabe, saying that it is better to look east where the sun rises than to look west where it sets, and that sort of underpins the look east policies that the Zimbabwe undertook during his regime, right? So not very much has changed. What has changed, especially with the Chinese activities on the continent, is rather that the terms are much more flexible than to African countries than what the West provide. And for that, I will go to where I am. So in my village, we say, and this, I'm sure most of these things have connections with other places, other cultures. In my village, we say, you want to go to a place where you dance and be applauded than to go to a place where you dance and be booed, right? So African countries will go to China where they are much more appreciated than come to Washington, D.C., where the president will not even be available to see them, right? So that is an issue. The issue of democracy, I've always said that, democracy is good, but it's not the only form of government. There are other forms of government that we can make better, right? And I want to see an indigenous African system that it inures to the whole African continent, or maybe a form of democracy that is more African-centered than the Western nature, because now election financing has caused a lot of problems across Africa. And most of the money for development are held until the year of election, where they are released to finance projects for people to win election, and that's the end of it. I'll end there and pass the baton over to Arhin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tsikudo, for that, and also Dr. Choti and Francis for the questions. I'll start with Dr. Choti's question, the various one, whether, just opposing China with the West, right? What I would say is that let's look at what both partners have offered, right, in the past, now, and then moving forward, what do we expect from them? When you take the West, the African leaders like Ramaphosa of South Africa and co have argued that the relationship is more paternalistic, and that it can be supported with evidence, right? Where there's that colonial underpinnings in Africa's engagement with Europe and the rest of the West. That is there. Now, because of what we had already highlighted about, where contemporary Africa-China relationship started from, as fighting colonialism and coming as comrades in arms against a system of oppression. China and Africa want to see themselves as co-equals. And this is something that has been echoed and has been restated over and over again. And it's actually also showing in terms of not just policies, but also practice. For example, take any Africa, whatever summit, right? We have the Africa-UK summit, we have the US-Africa summit, and then we have the FOCAC. For all of them, Africans are invited to come to those countries. The 54, 55 African leaders are all invited, and they all fly out to Africa from Africa to go meet these partners in their countries. Now you take FOCAC. FOCAC has oscillated between China and Africa, right? So the Chinese, Xi Jinping meets Africans in Africa, and then the Africans meet him in China. That is a signaling, right, of that, and talks about this co-equals and this issue of win-win. Now, Dr. Kwame makes a good point of what is important is the African agency in all of this, right? But the African agency is important if Africans will actually be given the platform to exert their agency, or will be in a space where they can actually exert their agency. What you find with Africa's engagement with the West, for the most part, is that usually they come to the table where the meals are already cooked. And then Africa is asked to choose what they want to eat, or even sometimes served what is available. But we have seen from the China policy where China comes in and comes with blank and says, okay, let's go into the kitchen and what do we want to cook? But these are the ingredients we have, but what do we want to cook? We saw this with China's first security forum with African countries, right? I had calls from international media outlets who sort of suppose that because China didn't come there with any concrete plan, that meeting had failed. And I said, no, that is actually the opposite, because China usually would come with nothing to say, what are we doing together? And I think that the West is so used to coming to the table with pre-cooked or cooked meals or policies that that is where the thinking is coming from. And once you do that, now Africa doesn't even have the opportunity to even show agency. All they can say is that I wouldn't eat, or I'll just eat this much. But the idea is that they had no influence in what to cook. With China, even though China is coming up with this policy of, okay, let's come to the kitchen and cook, Africa has been preconditioned to be cooked for, to the extent that it is taking Africa a lot of effort to actually come to terms with the fact that, okay, now we are being invited to the kitchen, what do we want to cook? Right. And that is one of the things our center advocates for. We are saying that you now have an opportunity to exert agency. It's not that you haven't been doing it, but you've been restrained for too long. Now those chains may have been removed, right? So can we now start doing that? Can we now start thinking about that? And that takes me back to the question about our say at FOCAC. You would find that from 2000 FOCAC, a lot has changed. Actually, the just ended FOCAC was applauded as the one with the most input from CSO, civil society organizations from the continent, and researchers and think tanks, because a lot of input went in from that angle. And now what the FOCAC does is that they have all these meetings in between to look at how well they are doing with their action plans. And one of the things that they are doing now is including think tanks to come up with ideas or to sort of assess what they are doing. Now, not to talk for too much, the issue of the youth, I think that to talk about Africa's youth, again, Africa's Youth Agency in Africa, China, first of all, we need to start building trust between the African youth and the African political leadership. Most African youth have lost faith in their political leadership, that they think that even thinking beyond the leadership is not possible because they know that their interests are not being heard, even at that national level. So most of them are even deterred from taking the conversation to the international level. But if they had that trust building and that avenue to engage with their leaders, then they can start thinking, okay, how do we also make an impact or an input into how you relate with our international partners? So I think we need to start from there. Build that trust between African governments and the youth. Like Dr. Tsikudo said, you will see how expensive African elections are. So even encouraging the youth to take political positions is almost impossible, because the kind of money they need, they can't afford. And the support is not there to help them do that. And so we applaud the Senegalese leader, and we hope that these will send a signal, at least to African youth, that it is possible to some extent. And so let's do our best. But again, we really need to build that a connection between that. The role of the African Union. I remember before the 2021 FOCAC, African Union actually, together with our center, had a webinar that brought together all the research centers doing work on China to brainstorm, our engagement with China and to present it at the FOCAC. So I think that some steps are being taken and we are applauding all these steps, but we are saying that more can be done, right? More can be done, especially when it comes to even funding. How do African think tanks and researchers get their funding? Are there any funding coming from within the researchers, think tanks, and research centers going to become like African agencies where our budgets are being funded by Western donors? So we really need to start thinking about these things, or international donors. I think there's a question, Doc, if you want to take it, from Miriam Kaburu. It says that what steps can African governments take to address concerns about debt sustainability related to Chinese loans and investment?
Sorry. Yeah. Thank you. The question of debt has been one that has bedeviled the discourse on China-Africa relations in recent times, and I think that at stake are several parameters. In terms of ways in which we can make this sustainable, I believe that having a plan where whatever is being sought in terms of aid or investment, whatever we want to call it, the Chinese prefer to call it development assistance or development cooperation. They should go into viable projects, right? So we have a viable project, and these projects are more, the agreement underpinning this are more transparent. So far, what we have seen is that most of these agreements are very opaque, and they are treated as state secrets, and therefore we don't end up, there's very little in terms of input from any other agency. Arhin was talking about civil society organization and all of that. We need to open the discourse and invite input from some of these agencies to be able to contribute to this agreement when they are being made. Because at the end of the day, either the loan or the agreement is for today, the debt will hang over, and we have to pay in one way or the other in the future with interest if possible. And so the best ways is to make sure that some of these are going to productive ventures. We are able to exert our agency in the negotiations, and we are able to make the agreement more transparent than they are, as they are being more treated now as a state secret. All right, so I will end there, and
there's a second question, which I think a very important question that I think you'd be interested in.
Okay.
So the second question is, how can African countries balance the need for foreign investment in agriculture with concerns about food sovereignty and local control over agricultural resources?
Yeah, this is a very important question. And over the years, we've had issues with land grab, which has to coming on being, sold out to the Chinese investors or taken away from them. In our own country, we've had an issue recently with that with the BNR project that was being undertaken in the forest, one of the forests in Eastern region. And so you have this huge investment sort of coming from the Chinese, and sometimes they tend to undermine local agriculture or local investment. And so I think that one of the ways in which you can balance this is will be maybe, how do you call it, joint ventures, right? And joint ventures based on the idea that the Chinese are bringing certain input, maybe it could be with money, it could be machinery, but then partner with local people to make sure that, the local people are not, driven off the land, but then they have their own input. They also have a stake in whatever is going on there. The local input is very important because it is almost impossible to have foreign investments in a place where people are not happy, right? So let's say you have a local, you have a community that has a large fertile tract of land, and someone comes there, want to do investment. Meanwhile, the local people are already doing their own stuff on there. You can't just drive the people off the land. You have to cooperate with them. You have to collaborate with them, right? So having their blessings will go a long way to ensure that the success of that. I have seen that even play out in my own village, where the youths were told to actually halt, and this was a project that's been undertaken by Chinese and also some Egyptians. So the youth were told to protest against both investors, because secondly, they ended up driving them because the chiefs have just auctioned the land or mortgaged the land to these people. And these are land that people are already farming on. So if you are not employing them, you're not working with them, why do you expect them to feed themselves? So the chiefs who is one of those people who hasn't delivered much, has generated a lot of controversies where the youths have gang up against him and the investors that they have brought onto the table. One of the ways in which we can make sure that this actually works better would be collaboration, joint ventures, collaborations, joint ventures. The Chinese don't have the land when they're investing in Africa. The land is in Africa, right? So people have stake in that land. It has to be properly, given out to them. People have stake in it, and so failure to do this, and across Africa, this has been an issue in a lot of places like Zimbabwe, Mozambique, even in Ghana, like I mentioned before. One of my projects that I did was in Bui, also has issues like this, where people have been displaced from the land for a big dam to be built, and where they are being put is so far away from where the Ghanaian government decided or is planning to put up an irrigation field, and there's no means of transport to get from where they are 13 kilometers to where the irrigation site is. So yeah, so all of this proper planning would also be a part of that conversation. Yeah, these are some of the elements that we need to consider.
Okay, Francis, please go for it.
Thank you so much. It's good we are talking about Africa, and we are Africans, and we are here. And in this, in this African tea session, basically we are flowing with our own African identity, and I love what was in the initial statement of the post-COVID, connection with China. How do we move on? And I think Dr. Kwame, one thing you say that was exciting for me was that our African indigenous knowledge, skills, and medicinal processes saved us a lot. And I think today in Africa, most people still continue taking their concoction. We still continue taking our concoction. I actually had one this evening, and that so it keeps us, and we discover, there's this branch, there's this root. When you make for example, ginger, or you use turmeric, or even the guava leaves, so there are many things around here that I found we discovered was strong. And yes. I want to ask, because we need also to be careful a bit to see then how do we sort of safeguard this knowledge and skill so that we also don't expose ourselves too much, that there are too many things we are removing from African soil. And I think that's what I think Kaburu was talking about in terms of the agriculture, because that's where it is. How can we make it that the relationship, there are things we've safeguarded, these are no-go zone? I don't think everything.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I remember the concussions very well, and when the pandemic was happening, I have cousins in the UK who will call me and give me the ingredient that I need to get to to get my concussion going. We've had the one in Madagascar, which became a national issue, all of that, and in Ghana we've had the same issue with traditional versus Western medicine and all of that, licensing and non-licensing and all of that. But I think one of the good things that the Ghanaian government had done over the years was to establish the Center for Scientific Research, which deals particularly with the traditional medicine folks. And then there is a new center that has been established at the University of Science and Technology to look at this. But that's just by the side. Now, in terms of how do we safeguard our African traditions, this is a very important, very important conversation that I think at this point we all need to be involved in. So like I mentioned, everything, so there's a piece that was recently, there were two pieces. One was published during the pandemic by Professor Acheampong, which at the University of Texas, which a very short piece. And then there was an updated one, which was published, I think, about a year ago, also in African Geographical Journal, which I edit, by the way. And in that conversation, we are talking about this indigenous systems and all of that stuff. And anytime I have the opportunity to teach contemporary global issues, I read that thing. And anytime I read it, I have a new epiphany about some of the things that they're talking about. And the issue of preserving African values, traditions, always ring a bell. Like, how can we do this in the context of globalization? I believe one of the ways, and a lot of countries are doing it better than others. Ghana is one of those that is worse at doing it. Or maybe not all of Ghana, but some traditional, some ethnic groups are better than. It's our language. Like, I think a lot of African countries are losing a lot by not even trying to speak their local language, because there's so much value in that in terms of how some of this information is transmitted. There are things I know by just being with my grandparents when I was growing up. And those things, I go and talk about them in my village. Some of the people in the village don't even know, because they were born in the city, just moved to the village, or they have never been there before at all, right? So not our knowledge system and our language, I believe that we should pay a close attention to that. There was a book that was published by Dr. Amoa and Co. At the University of Ghana, which also talk about some of this stuff. And they were talking about food, gastro diplomacy, something like that. They were talking about how you go to America and you ask for Italian food, right? But nobody goes to America and asks for African food or Nigerian food, Kenyan food, South African food. People go to the UK and want Chinese food. People go to all places and ask for specific kind of food. But we Africans, we don't have such a culture. Like, say, if you have an African market here, nobody even goes there. The market has to close up because there's no, you can't run anything on that. But the cuisine systems, right? Our cuisines, we are losing. I mean, like, Arhin was talking about using the metaphor of what to cook and all of that, which is important. But I think in literal terms, we should also think about our food system, the cuisines, right? The cuisine, like you go to South Africa, what are the indigenous people eating? Everything now is westernized. And this also has a way to connect to not only China and Africa, but it has importance, in terms of even our own well-being and economic well-being, right? Not everybody has Western education. Someone will set up a restaurant, what are they cooking there? Fried rice, So there is a lot of things there's a lot of conversation we could have, but I think the principal thing that we need to consider is our language. The language, some languages are going defunct. In Ghana, we had a conversation that has been going on for a long time about the Guans, who are thought to be the original settlers of Ghana. Now, the Guan people don't even want to speak their own language, and nobody really knows where they are concentrated. Right? The same goes with other ethnic groups, right? So we lose the language and then we lose the people. Right? So language, we need to preserve that. But it goes hand in hand. And also our food system, the cuisines, right? The gastro diplomacy. Why don't I know about the Jollof War, right? I know about the Jollof War. Within the West African continent, Ghana Jollof, Liberia Jollof, and Nigeria Jollof. I believe I was told that my sister told me that the Senegalese have the best Jollof. I've never eaten that one yet, but I want to believe that is true, right? So those are some of the things I will put on the table for further discussion. But I'm happy to hear from you too if you have
Hey.
other things you want to add to that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Doc, for that. I would just go and to just touch a little bit on Miriam's second question. In terms of agric, with concerns food sovereignty and all of that, I think one of the big issues that we've had is the issue of GMOs, right? And what to grow and how to grow it. We've seen this diplomatic war. Actually, just yesterday I read that South Africa and the US are trying to resolve their diplomatic issues. And one of the things that led to that was the issue of importation of American chicken, where the South Africans said that it didn't meet their local standards. And so that created a whole issue for South Africa with relations to the United States. Now, putting this in the context of COVID, when COVID came, and as you mentioned, Francis, when people were doing their concoctions now they wanted the local ginger. They didn't want the huge imported ginger, right? They wanted the local ones. And so you see that when they realized that, or Africa realized that the world wasn't coming to save it from COVID-19, what did we quickly do? We looked internally. That means that we really subconsciously have some faith in our internal stuff. But because the Western and external ones are readily available or readily pushed to us, we do not really have the luxury to look internal. And I want to believe that is one of the things that Miriam is trying to raise, that issue, right, of, what even meets the standards. If you're looking at, because, for example, I think it was Mozambique or so trying to send, or is it Kenya, products to China, and they were saying it didn't meet their standards, right? So if the US says that, okay, we are going to start exporting tomatoes, right, or we are going to import Kenyan tomatoes or something like that, and then they say, okay, you have to grow it with GMOs, and the Kenyans do not want to eat GMO grown tomatoes, what do we do then? Again, that goes to, as we're talking about African international relations, we're also looking at African continental relations, right? How do we start to enhance trade and investment within Africa? And that is where we talked about the infrastructure, the issue of infrastructure, right? We are looking at international or intercontinental infrastructure, like the Tazara Railway that connects multiple countries, right? Look at the aviation system within Africa. How do we, first of all, interconnect Africa so that Africa can now relate with China or the West as Africa? Now we can relate as Africa because we can't even trade amongst ourselves. How is it that it is easier to ship a container load from even Dubai to Ghana than to do that from Ghana to Nigeria? Right, which are all along the coast. So we really need to start looking at these issues internally, then we look outside. And I think we will be able to do that when Africans start to see value in Africa. It's about time that we saw our leaders show agency at the international level, agency at the national level. If you look at the Kagame report that came to sort of reform the African Union, there was a report, a post that talked about how Kagame was frustrated with how slow transforming Africa was, even policies within the African Union, right? So how do we move this? Because if we do not tackle that aspects of it, then everything we are saying, will just be talk. And we really need to, and again, the issue of even the language and the food. Can I come to Kenya and not go and eat a burger at the airport? How many African airports do you go to and find local dishes there? And even when you find them, look at how expensive they are for some weird reason, even on the continent, right? If I wanted Ethiopian food in Ghana, you see how expensive it is, but Chinese food will be very cheap. So how do we really deal with some of these things? And again, it's all about, getting the indigenous products to our various countries. If I wanted, I just blacked out of the name, what the Ethiopians used to make their food, which only grows in that region, to Ghana, or if an Ethiopian wanted to come and set up an Ethiopian restaurant, they can't even get products to the country because, of course, a movement of goods and services is almost impossible. And so we really, as one of the things that we are keen on as a center is actually looking at all these things. We really need to strengthen the base, and that is strengthening Africa as a continent so that we can at least negotiate even at the international level. Now, if an investor is coming, Dr. Adovo was talking about this, and then we're even looking at joint venture. The point is that because the African investor doesn't have enough money and resources, they usually do not have that much say. So if the guy comes and he says, I want to grow with this stuff here, and we know that this fertilizer is probably going to destroy the land after 10 years, what say does the African farmer or indigenous investor have? They just have to kowtow to it. And so these are the issues that we are looking at. And we are really trying to get the African Union that even though it is looking at Africa's external issues, we should really start looking at the internal issues and which of the partners will be interested, in helping Africa build its continental infrastructure. And I think that was what China started, and for some reason has lost that due to other international pressure. And we really want them to come back to that and say that we are going to help build Africa's internal infrastructure. Going back to Miriam's first question about financing the debt, the first point is that Africa needs, the infrastructure deficit is huge, $150 trillion. We really need more money, right? But once the money is coming, how do we make sure it is used for what it is meant to be used for, or that we get value for money? And that is where I'll leave it, that we really need to insist. Debt, everyone is in debt. The United States is in debt, right? But how do we make sure we really need more debt than less debt? We really need more money. We need more debt to finance our infrastructure deficit and other health and other sectorial deficits. So we need more money to come into Africa. How do we make sure that the US doesn't go to the IMF and get loans at 0% interest, and then Africa goes and gets it at over 25%? That is the issue we should be talking about, right? In COVID-19, if America was going for a $1 trillion loan from the IMF at 0%, why couldn't Africa go for a $1 trillion loan at 0%, right? And Africa is not going to go anywhere. We are not going to vanish tomorrow. So if you're talking about the risk adversement or the being risk adverse, of course, and the continent actually has the money to pay, and we know that, right? And so I'll leave it here and then leave for others who have questions or contributions. Dr. Eileen, I see you are online. I don't know if you have any questions, any comments. I see Musa Traore too, a very good friend. Kwame, did you have something to say?
No, I think those were well articulated. So
thank you.
Yeah, if other people have questions, yeah, I think Eileen.
Yeah, Dr. Eileen, please go ahead and unmute. You have the floor.
Hi everybody. Thank you for having me here. I want to say that instead of focusing on having more foreign direct investment or investors, it's like this, right? If a product is good, then you will not have problems having the customers. So everybody, whatever, even if they're buying something, they're trying to invest their money into something that they feel like is going to give them a equal or higher value of return in investment. So what I see is in Africa, we lack structure and systems to give us, to give the investors a perception of high return in investment and a guarantee in return in investment. So if we can actually focus on creating a system through, say, AU, ECOWAS, we start with the lowest hanging fruit, one project, one sector, one industry at a time, and then replicate it and scale it. And that's probably the best way to build investment confidence and investors, and lower the interest rate of capital borrowing. over the long term, but we have to start from somewhere. And so the investment part of it is that, is really about how do we create an investment system, whether it's domestic, whether it is foreign, so that the money, the chain of orders, chain of commands is clear, accountable, and that will itself will build investor confidence. Number two is when we're talking about compatibility between different working with different countries, I feel that we need to also need to focus on cultural, compatibility. I myself, I observe, because I live in the US, right? I've been in the US longer than anywhere else. But I am Chinese, and I came in this space. My fiance is Nigerian, and so and I've been in the space for a while. I work with youth empowerment and community economic development. I personally feel that there's a whole lot more compatibility, culturally speaking, between, say, Chinese and African than the West. I can say that with confidence because I was previously married to an American, a white American. And the cultural gap is really, the individualism in Western culture is celebrated, but that's not, how African culture or Chinese culture work. We work as a community. And I think that need to be stressed. And in any culture, there are bad people, there are good people, but it's really, trying to, I personally believe that everybody is always doing their best, trying, at their present level of awareness, but they a lack of communication about expectation, and then, communication gap can contribute to problem. I would say the highest currency value in Africa is actually trust. Trust among Africans, and then trust, between foreigners and Africans. And if that can be resolved, then we are golden. Thank you for letting me share.
Yeah, thanks for your input. Yes, I want to believe these are comments, but then I completely agree. And then there's a part of the FOCAC agreement, the 2021 agreement, that emphasize publications about agreements. And then I was telling Arhin and off the record some time ago that could be a game changer if we can bring a little bit more of transparency into the conversation. That will actually increase or boost investor confidence. As to the source of that input or insight into the document, I don't know. I mean, it's a document that I believe was collaboratively done between Africans and China. So if they are emphasizing publishing agreements, I think that would be good for everyone. At least we get to know and we can make input to that. So that is good. About the issue of cultural and economic compatibility, I agree. I agree that, yeah, there is a lot more shared values between a lot of African cultures and China than Western. The only problem we have is preference, right? A lot of people who have become so exposed, and they like, we prefer, So as Arhin was saying before about the cuisines and during the concoctions and the ingredient that goes into it during the COVID, people knew about this ingredient that were more indigenous, but they were not using it. They prefer. I have a personal story. My father will, when we were growing up, would send me to the pharmacy and say, buy me paracetamol. So paracetamol is just a painkiller. And he will insist that I buy the imported paracetamol, and that's a extent of, confidence that he has in, because during that time, it was the case that people, manufacturers of those drugs were even using cassava powder instead of real ingredients. So the efficacy level were in questions. And so, but there was a belief that the one that is imported, was always, you could trust that one, that it has the right ingredient to be more efficacious than one that was locally manufactured. So yes, sometimes we tend to shoot ourselves in the foot, but I think it's about time that we woke up and begin to act on some of this, build confidence, and also build trust among the citizenry.
It looks like we're
I think
getting close to the time.
Francis has his hands up again, or this is from a previous?
No, sorry. I know you're getting into the sleeping mode for somewhere across the continent, but
Okay,
something I think something that was
Francis,
mentioned. Yes.
no, I was just going to say, I don't know if Eileen has his hand up still, or it's from the previous question or comment.
I'm
Eileen?
sorry, it's an old hand. Let me lower it down. Yeah, sorry
Okay.
about that.
So then we'll have you, Francis, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you. I think every time we talk about Africa, it's a home we have, and we have a lot of passion and emotions and around how we find ourselves in the space of the global space. And two things are coming out from my sort of observation across Africa when I travel around the region, and sometimes also when I travel outside of Africa, and you're trying to see the perspective of different realities. And two things I have observed. One is basically about what again said about the culture, but also ingrained a lot in how we behave and how we are so socially connected. And I think that's why, Dr. Kwame, when you tried to get a survey, you realized quite a number of the people whom you interviewed were people who are from the civil society organizations or their trade union. There are people who are willing, and they have so much information about what's happening at the community level. I feel there could be a lot that we can do to involve the mass, to involve the people. And I think this is where you're asking what is behind the agreement, how is it drafted, but it's a question of what is the role of the civil society organizations, what is the role of the people. And of course, Democrats will say the leaders represent us. But I think in some issues, you will find the voice of the people coming in to argue and say this is not compatible. I think I like what she said. It's not compatible to us. So how are we going to work on the mindset? And how do we ensure this mindset process is ingrained into the future of agreements and processes that are going to take place within Africa, and not only with China, but I think also in terms of the global relationship. How are we a lesser continent, yet we have so much resources that we can use to be able to propel us. So I think that the question of the mindset will be critical in the future engagements within the research work, but also in terms of the conversation that we can have around the world and who we are as African. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gichoki, for those very wonderful comments and really on point in terms of still talking on the agency, like where are we in this discussion? How do we position ourselves as a continent in these discussions? So I know it's always, anytime that we start discussing this topic, it goes on and on, which is a good thing. That's why, in fact, we bring it back every year. And we really want to be thankful for the ASCIR, because we're discussing based on the data that they keep gathering, updating and gathering over the years, and it's current. So it's great that we can have an organization that is helping us have a base for our discussions on especially this particular topic of China-Africa relations. And as you can see, it's delving into many other issues related, of course, to the discussion, which means we have a lot more work and a lot more thinking and discussions to do. I see Musa. I really need to leave for another event, like starting at 5, but we can just have Musa as the final person and then we can close.
Okay, definitely. Thank you, Damaris. Thank you, Arhin, and thank you also. I joined this conversation very late. I cannot just join a panel where Arhin is a panelist. That I just want to say, you are doing, you have done a phenomenal coverage on this panel. And definitely, I had a few questions, but due to the sake of time, I will just answer to the last comment. How do you change the mindset? So from my background, I believe the mindset change in Africa is going to come from education, because if you look at countries like Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, the Human Development Index is so low to the point that there is nothing that can be done. Until we move that HDI number to a positive number, then we won't be able to have a very organized civil society with a programmatic agenda that can push through some policy change to make, that China or any other relation with the African continent. So that is my answer to that. And definitely I will leave it here for this time. Thank you so much, Damaris. Arhin, how you doing?
Thank you, Musa.
I'm doing very well, Musa. It's good to have you on here. It's really good to hear your
Yes.
voice.
Of course, definitely, yes. And I mean, as we wrap up, I can't thank you both enough, Dr. Tsikudo and Arhin, for this very wonderful discussion. And it always is wonderful. I can insist on that. As you can see, for those of us who have stayed here, or those of us who were here from the beginning, it's a discussion that really kind of, I feel like we never finish. And most of the discussions at tea time, I think it's work unfinished, because there's so much more to bring into the discussion and to learn from one another about. The comments shared, the vision for the continent itself in relation to the topic that we're discussing is huge, which means we really need, at the end of this year, I really think we need to have like some form of evaluation and talk about how do we want to keep going with tea time, especially with people like Francis who have been here for long. Because I feel like every time I mention we're coming back and maybe continuing the conversation, but every other topic that we discuss needs to be continued. So somehow I feel like, what are we supposed to do? But anyway, to be brief, let's conclude here, and really want to thank the speakers again and again, and the participants, the chat, the questions that have been asked. For those who were here to attend, we really want to thank everybody and welcome you back to the African Tea Time. We have our last one in 2 weeks, April 11th, and it's going to focus on partnerships for community development, and the discussion is going to focus on 2 projects funded by not an organization, but a unit here at Michigan State University for projects in Tanzania and Kenya. So we welcome you back, and then this is an ongoing forum. We never stop, only that when summer comes, we break and then come back in the regular semester. But thank you so much again. Have a nice evening for those of us who are retiring to bed, and some of us who are still continuing the day. See you back. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.